The edges of this quilt need to be finished off with binding. There are many different types of binding that you can buy or make. I'm going to show you how to make a double fold straight of grain or cross grain binding for this quilt rather than bias binding, as this is a wall hanging and you probably don't need to have that bias edging. The difference between the two is obvious. Straight of grain binding is cut on the straight or cross grain, and bias binding is cut on the bias. Bias binding is most useful if the edge of the quilt is curved because the bias allows it to stretch. Also, the quilt edge wears better with bias binding. Since this is a wall hanging, I don't worry about the wear and tear on the edge. To make your binding, you're going to need to choose your fabric. I've chosen this stripe here because I want some movement around the edge. But if you don't want the binding to show, just use your background fabric. Before you cut your fabric, you need to make sure that it has been pressed. And then I folded this from selvage to selvage. And I've folded it again so that I can cut my strips. I need to get a nice clean edge. So I'm going to cut this off. And now I'm ready to cut my strips. I'm going to cut these strips about about 2 1/8 inch. Let's see, let me line this up and get these something. So I'm going to cut them about 2 1/8 inch, but you can adjust this measurement depending on the thickness of your quilt sandwich, your seam allowance, and the width that you want for your completed binding. So I use warm and natural batting, and I'm going to sew kind of a fat 1/4 inch seam allowance. I want my finished binding to end up being about 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch wide. So that's not very wide. I just want a little edging. So 2 1/8. Here's my strip, and I need to cut 4 of these strips to make enough binding to go around the edge of the quilt. Before you sew all the strips into one long piece, you need to cut off these selvage edges. So I can just take my ruler and, oops, that's not up there enough, and trim off that edge. You don't want the selvage in your binding, so make sure that that's trimmed off before you sew all of them together. When I sew the strips together, I like to place them at 90-degree angles. I'm using this fabric because as a demo because it has a right side and a wrong side where the striped fabric is too hard to see. So I put the strips at 90-degree angles, and then I'm going to sew on this 45-degree line here. I can either draw that line, or it's easiest just to flip this over and press that line. And so when I sew, I just follow down the pressing mark. The reason why I like to sew my seams like this is because it allows for less bulk. So you can see this diagonal seam here, and I've got a piece here where it's just a straight seam. And you'll notice when I put this together, what's going to happen is right here underneath this seam there's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers of fabric, and then I have to fold it again. That means 12 layers of fabric, and what happens is you get like a bump in your binding, and you want to avoid that. So when you sew on the diagonal like this, let me take this out, and you press open those seams, And let's see, let's trim that before we go any further. I'm just going to trim it, just eyeball, like a 1/4 inch seam. So when you press that seam open, and when I fold it, you'll see this part of the seam goes in this direction, the other part of the seam goes in that direction, so they're not on top of each other. And when I fold it again, those seams are going to be evenly distributed, and so you do not get a bump on your binding. I also like to trim one end of my binding with a 45-degree angle. This makes it easier to finish off my binding, and it also helps avoid that bulk. So here's the one end of my binding. I'm going to take my ruler. Most rulers have a 45-degree line, or your cutting board has a 45-degree line. So it's up to you what you want to use, but I prefer to use my ruler. And I take my ruler with that 45-degree line, and I line it up on the edge of the strip. And now I'm going to cut this angle. Oops. And now I have a 45-degree angle on the end of one of my strips. Next, I need to take this to the pressing board and press wrong sides together. So on this fabric, it doesn't make a difference, but I'm going to take it to the pressing board, press wrong sides together like this, and then I'm ready to attach this to my quilt.